David Marston, a 75-year-old decorated black veteran with PTSD, entered the luxurious Valora Hotel with his faithful service dog, Max. Hoping for a peaceful stay, David was unaware that his presence would soon ignite a firestorm of prejudice and discrimination. The hotel's bigoted manager took one look at David and Max and decided they didn't belong in his high-class establishment. What followed was a barrage of racial slurs, humiliating demands, and outright disrespect that would push David to his very limits. Little did the manager know, his discriminatory actions would lead him down a path he'd bitterly regret, as he unknowingly challenged a man who had faced far worse on the battlefield. How far would the manager go to drive David and his dog out? And what unexpected turn of events would make him instantly regret his cruel behavior? The grand facade of the Valora Hotel loomed before David Marston, its polished marble steps leading up to revolving glass doors that sparkled in the midday sun. At 75 years old, David's tall frame still carried the bearing of the high-ranking military officer he once was, though time had etched deep lines into his face and sprinkled his close-cropped hair with silver. His green uniform, adorned with an impressive array of medals, stood in stark contrast to the sleek, modern interior of the hotel lobby. As David stepped through the revolving door, his golden retriever, Max, padded faithfully by his side. The dog's red service vest stood out against his golden fur, a clear indicator of his important role in David's life. The lobby bustled with activity. Smartly dressed business people hurried to meetings, tourists milled about with maps and cameras, and hotel staff moved efficiently among the guests. Despite the energetic atmosphere, David felt a familiar unease creeping up his spine. The opulent surroundings, with their crystal chandeliers and plush carpets, seemed to highlight how out of place he felt. It had been years since he'd stayed in such a luxurious establishment, and the decision to come here hadn't been an easy one. But his old friend, Mr. Hargrove, had insisted on meeting him here, and with Max by his side, David had found the courage to accept the invitation. As they approached the reception desk, David couldn't help but notice the subtle shift in the atmosphere. Conversations quieted, and he felt the weight of curious and sometimes disapproving glances. He straightened his back, a reflex from years of military service, and focused on the task at hand. The receptionist, a young woman with carefully styled blonde hair and a crisp white blouse, looked up as David approached. Her welcoming smile faltered for a moment as her gaze flickered between David and Max. "Good afternoon," David said, his voice calm and measured. "I have a reservation under Marston." The receptionist's perfectly manicured nails clacked against the keyboard as she searched for his booking. "I'm sorry, sir, but we don't allow pets in the hotel," she said, her tone carrying a hint of disdain. David took a deep breath, steeling himself for a conversation he'd had countless times before. "Max is not a pet," he explained patiently. "He's my service dog. I have all the necessary documentation right here." He reached into his jacket pocket and produced a folder containing Max's certification papers. The receptionist's lips thinned as she reluctantly accepted the documents. Her eyes scanned the papers, her frown deepening with each passing second. "These seem to be in order," she admitted grudgingly, "but I'll need to check with my manager about this unusual situation." David felt a familiar tightening in his chest, a mix of frustration and anxiety that threatened to overwhelm him. Max, sensing his distress, pressed his warm body against David's leg, offering silent support. David reached down to scratch behind Max's ears, drawing comfort from the simple gesture. "I understand," David said, his voice steady despite the turmoil he felt inside. "But I assure you, Max is a legally recognized service animal, and under the Americans with Disabilities Act, he has every right to accompany me during my stay." The receptionist's eyes widened slightly at David's knowledgeable response. She glanced around as if hoping a manager would materialize to handle the situation. Finding no such support, she turned back to her computer, her movements stiff with obvious discomfort. "Very well, Mr. Marston," she said, her tone clipped. "I've found your reservation. You'll be in room 412. She slid a keycard across the counter, careful to avoid any contact with David's hand. "The elevators are to your left. Enjoy your stay." David pocketed the keycard and nodded his thanks, choosing not to acknowledge the receptionist's clear displeasure. As he and Max made their way to the elevators, he could feel the weight of stares from other guests and staff members. The familiar feeling of being an outsider, of not belonging, settled over him like a heavy cloak. Inside the elevator, David leaned against the wall, suddenly feeling every one of his 75 years. Max sat at attention by his side, his warm brown eyes fixed on David's face, offering silent comfort. As the elevator ascended, David reflected on the subtle hostility he'd encountered in just the first few minutes of his stay. He wondered, not for the first time, if accepting Mr. Hargrove's invitation had been a mistake. But as the elevator doors opened on the 4th floor, David squared his shoulders. He was a decorated veteran, a man who had faced far worse than disapproving looks and barely concealed prejudice. He and Max would weather this stay, just as they had weathered so many challenges before. With renewed determination, David stepped out of the elevator, ready to face whatever the next few days might bring. The soft whir of the air conditioning greeted David as he swiped the keycard and pushed open the door to room 412. Max trotted in ahead of him, his nails clicking softly on the tiled entryway before he paused, waiting for David's command. "Check," David said quietly, and Max began a careful inspection of the room, a routine they had perfected over years of traveling together. As Max went about his task, David took in his surroundings. The room was smaller than he had expected, especially given the Valora Hotel's reputation for luxury. A queen-sized bed dominated the space, its crisp white linens a stark contrast to the muted beige walls. A small desk was tucked into one corner, while a modestly sized flat-screen TV hung on the wall opposite the bed. David's brow furrowed as he noticed the view from the single window, a brick wall of the adjacent building, barely 10 feet away. He couldn't help but wonder if this was the room he had originally been assigned, or if the receptionist had deliberately given him one of the hotel's less desirable accommodations. With a weary sigh, David set his suitcase on the luggage rack and began to unpack. His movements were methodical, a habit ingrained from decades of military service. As he hung up his spare uniform and carefully arranged his toiletries in the small bathroom, he tried to shake off the feeling of disappointment that had settled over him. Max, having completed his inspection, returned to David's side and let out a soft whine. David reached down to scratch behind the dog's ears, drawing comfort from the familiar gesture. "It's all right, boy," he murmured. "We've had worse, haven't we?" As if in agreement, Max leaned his weight against David's leg, his solid presence a reminder of why they were here in the first place. Without Max, David knew he wouldn't have had the courage to accept Mr. Hargrove's invitation, let alone make the journey to this unfamiliar city. Finished with unpacking, David sank onto the edge of the bed, the springs creaking slightly under his weight. The journey had been long, and the less-than-warm welcome at reception had drained what little energy he had left. He closed his eyes, trying to center himself, but found his mind drifting back to the lobby, replaying the receptionist's thinly veiled hostility. Max, sensing David's unease, rested his head on David's knee. The simple act of comfort brought David back to the present, reminding him of the techniques his therapist had taught him for managing his PTSD. He focused on his breathing, on the warmth of Max's head on his leg, on the soft hum of the air conditioning. Slowly, the tension began to ebb from David's shoulders. He opened his eyes and gazed down at Max, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "What do you say we order some room service, boy? I think we've earned a little treat after that reception downstairs." Max's tail thumped against the carpet in response, and David chuckled softly. He reached for the room service menu on the bedside table, flipping through the pages until he found something that appealed to him. A simple turkey sandwich and a pot of chamomile tea. As he dialed the number for room service, David tried to push aside his lingering concerns about the hotel staff's attitude. He was here to meet an old friend, to reconnect and reminisce. He wouldn't let the narrow-mindedness of a few individuals ruin this opportunity. The phone rang several times before someone answered, their voice curt and rushed. David placed his order, speaking clearly and politely, despite the abrupt manner on the other end of the line. As he hung up, he couldn't shake the feeling that his interactions with the hotel staff were going to be an ongoing challenge. With a sigh, David leaned back against the headboard, patting the bed beside him. Max jumped up, settling into the curve of David's body, his warm weight a comforting presence. As they waited for the room service to arrive, David found himself drifting into an uneasy doze, the events of the day swirling in his mind. In his half-sleep, memories of his military service mingled with the faces he'd encountered in the hotel lobby. The sound of distant explosions morphed into the clatter of luggage carts in the hallway, and the acrid smell of gunpowder became the sterile scent of hotel laundry detergent. David jerked awake, his heart racing, as a sharp knock on the door announced the arrival of his room service order. Max was already alert, his ears pricked forward, ready to offer support if needed. David took a deep breath, grounding himself in the present moment before standing to answer the door. As he reached for the handle, David steeled himself for another potentially uncomfortable interaction. Despite the challenges he'd faced so far, he was determined to approach each new encounter with dignity and grace. After all, he'd faced far worse in his lifetime. This was just another mission, another obstacle to overcome. The door swung open to reveal a middle-aged woman in a crisp hotel uniform, her dark hair pulled back into a tight bun. She stood rigidly, holding a tray with David's order, her eyes fixed on a point somewhere over his shoulder. "Room service?" she announced, her voice flat and disinterested. "Thank you," David replied, stepping aside to allow her entry. "You can set it on the desk there." The maid's eyes darted around the room, widening slightly when they landed on Max, who was still lounging on the bed. Her lips pressed into a thin line, and she moved stiffly towards the desk, her body language screaming discomfort. As she set down the tray, her movements were jerky and rushed, causing the china to rattle. The teapot teetered dangerously close to the edge before David reached out to steady it. "Careful," he said gently, "that was a close one." The maid didn't respond, didn't even look at him. Instead, she muttered under her breath, her words just loud enough for David to catch. "Dogs don't belong in hotels. Filthy animals." David felt a familiar tightness in his chest, a mix of anger and hurt that he had experienced far too many times in his life. He took a deep breath, reminding himself that confrontation rarely led to understanding. "Ma'am," he said, keeping his voice calm and steady, "Max is a service dog. He's not just a pet, but a necessary support for my medical condition." The maid's eyes flicked to David's face for a brief moment, before dropping away. She gave a non-committal grunt and turned to leave, her body language clearly communicating her desire to be anywhere but in this room. As she reached the door, David spoke again. "Thank you for bringing up the food. I hope you have a good rest of your day." The maid paused for a fraction of a second, her hand on the doorknob. For a moment, David thought she might turn back, might offer some word of acknowledgement, but then the moment passed, and she was gone, the door clicking shut behind her. David stood there for a long moment, staring at the closed door. The encounter, brief as it was, had left him feeling drained and disheartened. It wasn't just the maid's words, but the entire atmosphere of subtle hostility he'd encountered since arriving at the hotel. Max, sensing David's distress, jumped down from the bed and padded over to him, pressing his warm body against David's leg. The familiar weight and warmth helped to ground David, pulling him back from the edge of the dark thoughts that threatened to overwhelm him. "Thanks, boy," David murmured, reaching down to scratch behind Max's ears. "What do you say we eat this sandwich and then go for a little walk? I think we could both use some fresh air." Max's tail wagged in response, and David couldn't help but smile. No matter how difficult things got, he could always count on Max's unwavering support and affection. As David settled at the desk to eat his sandwich, he found his appetite had diminished. The turkey, which had sounded appealing earlier, now tasted like sawdust in his mouth. He forced himself to eat, knowing he needed to keep up his strength, but each bite was a struggle. The chamomile tea, at least, was soothing. As David sipped the warm liquid, he felt some of the tension begin to ease from his shoulders. He closed his eyes, focusing on the simple act of breathing, in and out, just as his therapist had taught him. When he opened his eyes again, David's gaze fell on his reflection in the room's small mirror. The face that looked back at him was tired, the lines around his eyes and mouth deeper than he remembered. But there was still strength there, in the set of his jaw and the steadiness of his gaze. He was David Marston, a decorated veteran who had served his country with honor. He had faced enemy fire, had led men into battle, had made decisions that meant the difference between life and death. He had survived the horrors of war and the long, difficult road of recovery that followed. This subtle discrimination, these microaggressions, this was just another battle. And like all the battles before, David was determined to face it with courage and dignity. With renewed resolve, David finished his tea and stood up. "Come on, Max," he said, his voice stronger now. "Let's go see what the rest of this hotel has to offer." As they left the room, David squared his shoulders and lifted his chin. Whatever challenges lay ahead, he and Max would face them together. They had weathered worse storms than this, and they would weather this one too. As David and Max made their way down the hotel corridor, the tension from the earlier encounters still weighed heavily on David's mind. The plush carpet muffled their footsteps, creating an almost eerie silence broken only by the distant hum of the elevator and the occasional muted voices from behind closed doors. They rounded a corner, and David nearly collided with a cleaning cart parked outside one of the rooms. A woman in a hotel uniform straightened up from where she had been bent over the cart, surprise evident on her face. "Oh, I'm so sorry," she exclaimed, quickly moving to push the cart aside. "I didn't mean to block the way." David waved off her apology with a smile. "No harm done," he assured her. "We should have been paying more attention ourselves." The woman, whose name tag identified her as Anita, returned his smile warmly. Her eyes, a rich brown that crinkled at the corners, moved from David to Max, and her face lit up. "Well, hello there, handsome," she said, addressing Max. "Aren't you just the most beautiful boy?" Max's tail began to wag, responding to the genuine warmth in Anita's voice. David felt some of the tension leave his body, touched by this simple act of kindness. "His name is Max," David said, a note of pride in his voice. He's my service dog." Anita's smile didn't falter at this information. Instead, she nodded understandingly. "Service dogs are amazing," she said. "My nephew has one to help with his epilepsy. They're like angels on 4 legs, aren't they?" David felt a lump form in his throat, touched by Anita's easy acceptance and understanding. "They certainly are," he agreed, his voice slightly rough with emotion. Anita must have noticed something in his expression because her own softened with concern. "Is everything okay with your room, sir? Can I help with anything?" The question, asked with such genuine care, nearly undid David. After the cold reception he'd received from the other staff members, Anita's kindness felt like a balm to his wounded spirit. "The room is fine," David assured her, not wanting to burden this kind woman with his troubles. "We were just heading out for a little walk." Anita nodded, but her perceptive gaze suggested she sensed there was more to the story. "Well, if you need anything at all, don't hesitate to ask for me," she said. "I'm usually on this floor or down in the lobby." "Thank you, Anita," David said, meaning it from the bottom of his heart. "That's very kind of you." As they prepared to continue on their way, Anita spoke up again. "You know, there's a nice little courtyard garden on the 2nd floor," she said. "It's usually pretty quiet this time of day. Might be a good place for you and Max to get some fresh air without having to leave the hotel." David felt a rush of gratitude for this thoughtful suggestion. "That sounds perfect," he said. "Thank you for the tip." Anita beamed at him. "My pleasure, sir. You two enjoy your walk now." As David and Max made their way to the elevator, David felt a weight lift from his shoulders. Anita's kindness had been like a ray of sunshine breaking through storm clouds, reminding him that there were still good people in the world. In the elevator, David leaned against the wall, taking a moment to center himself. Max sat at attention by his side, ever vigilant to his master's needs. David reached down to scratch behind Max's ears, drawing comfort from the familiar gesture. "What do you say, boy?" he murmured. "Should we check out this courtyard garden?" Max's tail thumped against the elevator floor in response, making David chuckle. As the elevator descended to the second floor, David found himself looking forward to exploring this hidden oasis Anita had told them about. After spending some time in the peaceful courtyard garden, David decided to head to the lobby. He had always been a people watcher, finding fascination in the ebb and flow of human activity. The lobby of a busy hotel like the Valora seemed like the perfect place to indulge in this pastime and observe the diverse array of guests and staff going about their day. David settled into one of the plush brown sofas scattered throughout the spacious lobby. Max lay down at his feet, ever alert but perfectly calm. David pulled out his smartphone more as a prop than anything else. He didn't want to appear as though he was staring at the other guests, even though that was precisely what he intended to do. The lobby was a hive of activity. Guests checked in and out, bellhops ferried luggage to and fro, and smartly dressed business people hurried through on their way to meetings or conferences. David observed it all with quiet interest, his eyes moving from one scene to another behind the shield of his phone. He had been sitting there for about half an hour when he noticed a man in a crisp blue suit striding purposefully across the lobby. There was an air of authority about him that suggested he was someone important in the hotel hierarchy. The man's red tie stood out starkly against his white shirt, like a slash of warning. As the man drew nearer, David could make out more details. He was white, probably in his late 40s, with a bald head that gleamed under the lobby lights. His eyes scanned the lobby as he walked, and when they fell on David and Max, his expression darkened noticeably. The man changed course, heading directly for David. As he approached, David straightened on the sofa, years of military training kicking in automatically. He met the man's gaze steadily, refusing to be intimidated by the obvious hostility he saw there. Without so much as a greeting, the man spoke, his voice low but carrying a clear note of disdain. "Dogs aren't allowed here, you know." David took a deep breath, steeling himself for what he knew would be a difficult conversation. "Sir," he began, his voice calm and measured, "Max is a service dog. He's allowed by law to be here with me." The man's frown deepened, his eyes flicking dismissively over Max before returning to David. "Service dog or not, this is a high-class establishment. We have standards to maintain." The implication was clear, and it cut David to the core. This man wasn't just objecting to Max's presence, he was suggesting that David himself didn't belong in a high-class establishment like the Valora. David felt a familiar tightening in his chest, a mix of anger and hurt that he had experienced far too many times in his life. But years of dealing with such situations had taught him the value of remaining calm. Losing his temper would only reinforce this man's prejudices. "I understand your concern for the hotel's standards," David said, his voice steady despite the emotion roiling inside him. "I assure you, both Max and I will conduct ourselves appropriately during our stay. Now, if you don't mind, I didn't catch your name or position here at the hotel." The man's eyes narrowed at David's composed response. He seemed to have expected, perhaps even hoped for, a more confrontational reaction. "I'm Mr. Griffin, the hotel manager," he said stiffly, "and while you may have a reservation, I'll be keeping an eye on you and your dog." Without waiting for a response, Griffin turned on his heel and strode away, leaving David sitting there, outwardly calm but inwardly shaken. Max, sensing David's distress, shifted closer, resting his head on David's knee. The familiar weight and warmth helped to ground David, pulling him back from the edge of the dark thoughts that threatened to overwhelm him. David reached down to scratch behind Max's ears, drawing comfort from the simple gesture. "It's okay, boy," he murmured. though whether he was reassuring Max or himself he wasn't quite sure. "We've dealt with people like him before, we'll get through this too." As he sat there, stroking Max's soft fur, David couldn't help but reflect on the stark contrast between this encounter and his earlier interaction with Anita. It was a painful reminder of the reality he had lived with all his life, that for every person who saw him as a human being worthy of respect, there seemed to be another who saw only the color of his skin and jumped to their own prejudiced conclusions. The lobby suddenly felt less welcoming, the opulent surroundings seeming to close in around him. David found himself longing for the peace of the courtyard garden, or better yet, the safety and comfort of his own home. But he pushed these thoughts aside. He was here for a reason, to meet his old friend, to reconnect and reminisce. He wouldn't let the narrow-mindedness of people like Griffin ruin this opportunity. With a deep breath, David settled back into the sofa, determined to stand his ground. He and Max had every right to be here, and he wouldn't let Griffin's prejudice drive them away. Little did he know, this was just the beginning of his confrontations with the hotel manager. As David continued to observe the lobby from his vantage point on the brown sofa, Max resting quietly by his feet, his attention was drawn to a commotion near the reception desk. To his dismay, he recognized the figures involved: Griffin, the hostile hotel manager, and Anita, the kind janitor he had met earlier. David's posture stiffened as he took in the scene. Griffin towered over Anita, his face flushed with anger, while Anita stood with her head bowed, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "Don't have time for people like you slowing us down," Griffin's voice carried across the lobby, dripping with disdain. "If you can't keep up with the pace here, maybe you should find somewhere more suitable for your abilities." Anita's voice was too low for David to hear, but her body language spoke volumes. Her shoulders were hunched, her whole posture radiating discomfort and distress. David felt a surge of anger course through him. The injustice of the situation was painfully clear. Anita, who had shown nothing but kindness and professionalism, was being berated and belittled by a man who seemed to thrive on wielding his authority to intimidate others. For a moment, David hesitated. A lifetime of experience had taught him the potential consequences of intervening in such situations. But as he watched Griffin continue his tirade, saw Anita shrink further into herself with each harsh word, he knew he couldn't stand by and do nothing. With a deep breath, David straightened his shoulders and stood up, Max rising to attention beside him. As he approached, he could hear more of Griffin's words, each one stoking the fire of his indignation. "Lazy and incompetent. I don't know why we even bother hiring." "That's not how you treat your staff," David's voice rang out, calm but firm, cutting through Griffin's rant. Both Griffin and Anita turned to look at him, surprise evident on their faces. Anita's eyes widened in recognition, a flicker of relief passing across her features before being replaced by worry. Griffin's surprise quickly morphed into anger. "This is none of your business," he snapped. "This is a staff matter." David stood his ground, meeting Griffin's glare with a steady gaze. "When you're berating a staff member in the middle of the lobby, you make it everyone's business," he said evenly. "There's no excuse for speaking to anyone that way, especially someone who's just trying to do their job." Griffin's face flushed an even deeper shade of red. "How dare you interfere?" he began, but David cut him off. "No, sir. How dare you treat your employees this way?" David's voice was low but intense, years of command lending weight to his words. A leader's job is to support and guide their team, not to bully and demean them. For a moment, Griffin seemed at a loss for words, clearly unaccustomed to being challenged. Then his eyes narrowed, and he leaned in closer to David, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "You're on thin ice here, old man. Don't forget you're a guest in this hotel. I can make your stay very uncomfortable if you don't mind your own business." David didn't flinch. He'd faced far more intimidating figures than Griffin in his time. "Is that a threat, Mr. Griffin?" he asked calmly. "Because I'd hate to have to report to your superiors that the hotel manager is threatening guests." Griffin's mouth opened and closed wordlessly, his face a mask of fury. Finally, he spat out, "This isn't over," before turning on his heel and storming away. As Griffin's footsteps faded, David turned to Anita, his expression softening with concern. "Are you all right?" he asked gently. Anita nodded, though her hands were still trembling slightly. "Thank you," she whispered. "You didn't have to do that." "Yes, I did," David said firmly. "No one deserves to be treated that way. Has he spoken to you like that before?" Anita's hesitation was answer enough. David felt a fresh wave of anger, but he pushed it down, focusing on the woman in front of him. "Anita, that kind of behavior is not okay. It's workplace harassment and it's illegal. Have you considered reporting him?" Anita's eyes darted nervously around the lobby. I can't," she said softly. "I need this job, and who would believe me over him?" David's heart ached at the resignation in her voice. It was a feeling he knew all too well, the powerlessness in the face of systemic injustice. But he also knew the importance of standing up, of pushing back against that injustice whenever possible. "I would," he said firmly. "I saw what happened here, and I'd be willing to back you up if you decide to report him. You don't have to decide anything now, but please know that you have options. What he's doing is wrong, and you don't have to endure it." Tears welled up in Anita's eyes, and she quickly wiped them away. "Thank you," she said again, her voice thick with emotion. I'll think about it." David nodded, understanding the weight of the decision she faced. "Take care of yourself, Anita," he said warmly, "and if you need any help, don't hesitate to ask." As Anita hurried away to resume her duties, David remained standing in the lobby, lost in thought. The confrontation with Griffin had stirred up a mix of emotions: anger at the injustice, pride in standing up against it, and a deep, weary sadness at the realization that such battles were still necessary in this day and age. Max nudged David's hand with his nose, bringing him back to the present moment. David looked down at his faithful companion, drawing strength from Max's unwavering presence. "You're right, boy," David murmured. "We can't solve all the world's problems in one day, but we can do our part, can't we?" As they made their way back to the brown sofa, David couldn't shake the feeling that his confrontation with Griffin had set something in motion. The tension in the air was palpable, and he couldn't help but wonder what repercussions might follow. David had barely settled back into the brown sofa when he saw Griffin storming towards him, his face a mask of barely contained fury. The lobby had quieted, the other guests sensing the tension in the air and giving the approaching manager a wide berth. "What are you still doing here?" Griffin's voice was low but filled with venom. "I thought I made it clear earlier that you and your mutt aren't welcome." David took a deep breath, steeling himself. "Mr. Griffin," he said calmly, "I have a reservation at this hotel and a dinner engagement this evening. Max is my service dog, and we have every right to be here." Griffin's eyes narrowed dangerously. "Rights," he spat. "Just because you serve doesn't mean you and your filthy animal get to break the rules here. This is a respectable establishment, not some charity for washed-up vets who can't let go of the past." The words hit David like a physical blow. He had faced discrimination before, but the sheer viciousness of Griffin's attack left him momentarily speechless. Max, sensing his distress, pressed closer to David's side, a low growl rumbling in his chest. Griffin's gaze flicked to Max, his lip curling in disgust. "And keep that beast under control, or I'll have no choice but to call animal control. I'm sure they'd be very interested in a dangerous animal threatening hotel guests." That snapped David out of his shock. "Max is not dangerous," he said, his voice tight with controlled anger. "He's a highly trained service animal, and your treatment of us is not only unethical but illegal. I suggest you back off, Mr. Griffin, before you say something you can't take back." Griffin leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "Is that a threat, old man? Because let me tell you something. I've dealt with your kind before. You think you're special because you wore a uniform? Well, here's a newsflash. You're nothing. Just another washed-up vet trying to milk your service for all it's worth. I've got friends in high places, and I can make your life very difficult if you don't get out of my hotel right now." David stood his ground, years of military discipline keeping him outwardly calm, despite the storm of emotions raging inside him. "Mr. Griffin, I'm going to say this one last time. We have a legal right to be here. Your behavior is discriminatory and completely unacceptable. I would strongly advise you to walk away now, before you do something that could cost you your job." Griffin's face contorted with rage. For a moment it seemed like he might escalate the situation further. But then, perhaps realizing they were drawing attention from other guests, he took a step back. His eyes, however, remained fixed on David with a cold, calculated hatred. "This isn't over," Griffin hissed. "Enjoy your stay while you can, because I promise you it won't be pleasant." With that, he turned on his heel and stalked away, leaving David alone in the suddenly quiet lobby. As Griffin's footsteps faded, David felt a wave of exhaustion wash over him. He had faced enemy fire, led men into battle, made decisions that meant the difference between life and death. But this casual cruelty, this blatant discrimination, it wore on his soul in a way that even the horrors of war hadn't. Max whined softly, nudging David's hand with his nose. David looked down at his faithful companion, drawing strength from Max's unwavering presence. "It's okay, boy," he murmured, though whether he was reassuring Max or himself he wasn't quite sure. "We've weathered worse storms than this, haven't we?" As David sank back onto the sofa, he couldn't shake the feeling that this confrontation was far from over. Griffin's parting words hung in the air like a threat, and David knew that the coming days would likely bring more challenges. But as he sat there, with Max's comforting weight pressed against his leg, David resolved to face whatever came next with the same courage and dignity that had carried him through countless trials before. He was David Marston, decorated veteran, and he would not be cowed by the likes of Griffin or anyone else. As the evening wore on, David retreated to his room, the weight of the day's events pressing heavily upon him. The confrontations with Griffin, the microaggressions from the staff, the pitying or suspicious glances from other guests, it all swirled in his mind, threatening to overwhelm him. Sitting on the edge of the bed, David felt the familiar tightness in his chest, a sensation he knew all too well from his years of dealing with PTSD. The tension in the air, the hostility he'd faced, it all eerily echoed the hypervigilance and constant state of alert he'd experienced in war zones. David closed his eyes, focusing on his breathing, just as his therapist had taught him. In, out, in, out. Slowly, he felt the edge of panic begin to recede, replaced by a deep, weary sadness. How many times had he faced situations like this? How many times had he been judged, not by the content of his character, but by the color of his skin? The weight of a lifetime of such experiences pressed down on him, threatening to crush his spirit. As if sensing his master's distress, Max pressed closer to David's side, his warm presence a silent reminder that David wasn't alone. David reached down, burying his fingers in Max's soft fur, drawing comfort from the simple, unconditional love of his faithful companion. "What do you think, boy?" David murmured, his voice barely audible. "Should we stand our ground or walk away?" Max looked up at him, brown eyes full of trust and devotion, and David felt a surge of resolve. He had faced worse than this, much worse. He had stared death in the face on battlefields far from home, had made decisions that weighed on his conscience to this day. Compared to that, what was one bigoted hotel manager? And yet the pain was there, raw and real. It wasn't just about Griffin or this hotel. It was about every slight, every dismissive glance, every door closed in his face over the years. It was about serving a country that still, too often, saw him as a second-class citizen. David's hand moved to his chest, fingers tracing the outline of his medals through his shirt. Each one represented a moment of courage, a sacrifice made in service of a higher ideal. He had believed in those ideals then, had been willing to die for them. Did he still believe now? The question hung in his mind as he replayed the day's events. He saw Anita's kind face, heard her words of understanding. He remembered the quiet dignity with which she had endured Griffin's abuse, and the gratitude in her eyes when David had stood up for her. A memory surfaced then, unbidden. David saw himself as a young soldier, standing tall in his newly pressed uniform, swearing an oath to defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. He remembered the pride he had felt in that moment, the sense of purpose, the belief that he was part of something greater than himself. That young soldier seemed so far away now, separated by years of hard-won experience and bitter disappointments. And yet that core of belief remained, tarnished perhaps, but not destroyed, because for every Griffin there was an Anita. For every closed door there had been a hand extended in friendship. The country he had served was flawed, yes, but it was also capable of great beauty, great kindness, great progress. As the night deepened outside his window, David felt a calm settle over him. He knew what he had to do. He would stand his ground, not just for himself, but for every person who had ever faced discrimination and injustice. He would stand as a living testament to the ideals he had sworn to uphold all those years ago. "Okay, Max," David said, his voice steady and resolved. "We're not going anywhere. This is our fight, and we're going to see it through." Max's tail thumped against the bed in response, and David couldn't help but smile. Whatever happened next, he wouldn't face it alone. He had Max, he had his principles, and he had the strength forged through a lifetime of overcoming adversity. As David prepared for bed, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, no doubt, but he would face them with dignity and courage, because that's who he was, not just a guest in a hotel, not just a veteran with PTSD, but a man who had dedicated his life to standing up for what was right. The battle lines had been drawn, and David Marston was ready to fight, not with fists or weapons, but with the quiet strength of a man who knows he's on the right side of history. With these thoughts swirling in his mind, David closed his eyes, the soft breathing of Max beside the bed a comforting presence. Slowly, he drifted into sleep, his resolve unshaken even in his dreams. The sharp, authoritative knock on the door jolted David from his uneasy sleep. For a moment, disoriented, he was back in the war zone, the sound of explosions echoing in his ears. His heart raced, sweat beading on his forehead, as the line between past and present blurred. Max was already alert, standing by the bed, his posture tense but calm. The dog's presence helped anchor David to reality, reminding him where he was, not in a distant battlefield, but in a hotel room in his own country. Another knock, more insistent this time. "Mr. Marston, this is the police. We need you to open the door." David took a deep breath, centering himself. He had known this moment might come, had prepared himself for it. But the reality of it still sent a chill down his spine. "Just a moment," he called out, his voice steady despite the turmoil in his gut. He quickly pulled on his uniform jacket, the familiar weight of his medals, a reminder of who he was and what he stood for. With Max at his side, David approached the door. He took another deep breath, squaring his shoulders before opening it. The hallway was crowded with people. 2 police officers stood at the forefront, their expressions serious. Behind them, looking smug and vindictive, was Griffin, the hotel manager. And hovering at the edges of the group, looking uncomfortable and out of place, were a few curious hotel guests who had been drawn by the commotion. "Mr. Marston," one of the officers asked, his tone professional but wary. David nodded. "That's me. What seems to be the problem, officers?" The second officer spoke up, her voice clipped and businesslike. "We received a complaint from the hotel management about a disruptive guest with an unauthorized animal. We're going to need you to come with us, sir." David felt a flare of indignation, but he kept his voice calm. "Officers, there seems to be a misunderstanding. Max here is my registered service dog. I have all the necessary documentation." He reached for the folder on the nearby desk, but Griffin's voice cut through the air, sharp and dismissive. "We don't care about your papers. This is my hotel. and I decide whether dogs are allowed or not. You were told to leave and you refused. That's trespassing." David turned to face Griffin, his expression a mixture of disappointment and resolve. "Mr. Griffin, you know as well as I do that service animals are protected under the Americans with Disabilities Act. You can't simply decide to ignore federal law." Griffin's face flushed with anger. "Don't you dare lecture me about the law, old man. You're the one breaking the rules here. Officers, I want him removed from the premises immediately, and that mutt too." The officers exchanged uncertain glances. It was clear they were uncomfortable with the situation, caught between Griffin's insistence and David's calm reasoning. "Sir," the female officer said, addressing David, "if you could just come with us, we can sort this out downstairs. We don't want to make a scene." David was about to respond when a new voice cut through the tension. "What on earth is going on here?" All heads turned to see a distinguished-looking man striding down the hallway, his expression a mixture of confusion and concern. David felt a wave of relief wash over him as he recognized his old friend, Mr. Hargrove. Griffin's demeanor immediately changed, his face paling as he recognized his boss, the owner of the hotel. He straightened up, trying to regain his composure. "Mr. Hargrove, sir," he said, his voice noticeably less confident, "I was just dealing with a troublesome guest. Nothing for you to worry about." Mr. Hargrove's eyebrows shot up. "Troublesome guest?" he repeated, his gaze moving from Griffin to David. Recognition dawned in his eyes, followed quickly by understanding and then anger. "Griffin," Mr. Hargrove said, his voice cold, "do you have any idea who this man is?" Griffin faltered, suddenly unsure. He's a guest who refused to follow hotel policy, sir. I was just—" "This man," Mr. Hargrove interrupted, his voice rising with each word, "is Colonel David Marston. He's a decorated war hero, a man who has sacrificed more for this country than you could ever imagine. And he's here at my personal invitation for dinner today with me." The silence that followed was deafening. Griffin's face drained of color as the implications of his actions began to sink in. The police officers shifted uncomfortably, clearly realizing they had been drawn into a situation far more complex than they had been led to believe. Mr. Hargrove turned to David, his expression softening. "David, old friend, I am so sorry for this disgraceful treatment. Please tell me what's happened here." As David began to explain the events of the past day, he could see the growing horror on Mr. Hargrove's face, the casual cruelty, the blatant discrimination, the complete disregard for the law. It all came pouring out, painting a damning picture of Griffin's behavior. When David finished speaking, Mr. Hargrove turned to Griffin, his face a mask of cold fury. "Griffin," he said, his voice low and dangerous, "you have exactly 5 minutes to clear out your office. You're fired. And I promise you, by the time I'm done, you'll never work in the hospitality industry again." Griffin sputtered, his face alternating between red and white. But sir, you can't—" "I can and I have," Mr. Hargrove cut him off. "Now get out of my sight before I decide to press charges for discrimination and harassment." As Griffin slunk away, thoroughly defeated, Mr. Hargrove turned to the police officers. "I apologize for the waste of your time, officers. I assure you there will be no more troubles here tonight." The officers nodded, clearly relieved to be able to extricate themselves from the situation. As they left, Mr. Hargrove turned back to David, his expression a mixture of regret and determination. "David, my friend," he said softly, his voice filled with regret and urgency, "I cannot begin to express how sorry I am for what you've endured here. This is not the welcome I had envisioned for you. I rushed over as soon as I heard, but I'm in the middle of an important meeting at the golf club. I have to get back, but please join me for dinner as we planned. We'll discuss everything in depth and ensure nothing like this ever happens in my hotel again." David nodded, understanding the constraints his friend was under. "Of course, John. Go handle your business. We'll talk tonight." With an apologetic smile and a firm handshake, Mr. Hargrove left, leaving David and Max standing in front of their room, still processing the whirlwind of events. As the sound of Mr. Hargrove's footsteps faded down the hallway, David and Max entered their room. David spent the next few hours resting and reflecting. He called his daughter to update her on the situation, took Max for a short walk in the hotel's courtyard garden, and tried to relax with a book, though his mind kept returning to the earlier events. At 7 p.m., David made his way down to the hotel's restaurant, Max faithfully by his side. He found Mr. Hargrove already waiting at a quiet corner table, away from the curious glances of other diners who had no doubt heard snippets of the day's commotion. As David sat down, with Max settling at his feet, he could see the strain of the day on his old friend's face. Mr. Hargrove looked tired but determined. "David," he began, his voice heavy with regret, "I want to thank you for giving me the time to start addressing this situation. I still can't begin to express how sorry I am for what you've endured here. This is not the welcome I had envisioned for you, and it's certainly not what this hotel should represent." David nodded, appreciating his friend's sincerity. "Thank you, John. It's been challenging, to say the least." "Challenging?" Mr. Hargrove shook his head. "It's been absolutely unacceptable. I had no idea Griffin harbored such prejudices. To think that this kind of discrimination was happening right under my nose." David leaned forward, his expression serious. "John, it's not just about Griffin. He may have been the most blatant, but the problem runs deeper. From the moment Max and I arrived, we've faced subtle and not so subtle discrimination from various staff members." Mr. Hargrove's face fell as David recounted the series of microaggressions and outright hostility he'd experienced during his short stay. The cold reception at check-in, the maid's muttered comments, the suspicious glances from other staff members. It painted a picture of a systemic issue that went beyond one prejudiced manager. I don't know what to say," Mr. Hargrove said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've always prided myself on running an inclusive establishment. To hear that this is happening, I feel like I've failed, not just as a business owner, but as a friend." David reached across the table, placing a comforting hand on his friend's arm. "John, you didn't know. But now that you do, you have the power to make changes." Mr. Hargrove nodded, a determined look settling on his face. "You're right. This ends now. I'll implement comprehensive diversity and sensitivity training for all staff. We'll review our hiring practices, our policies, everything. I'm just glad I'm in a position to make these changes. In today's world, we need to be proactive in fighting discrimination." David smiled, a glimmer of hope in his eyes. "I'm glad to hear that, John. This world needs CEOs like you, people who stand up against injustice. It won't be easy, but it's necessary." Mr. Hargrove returned the smile. Then his expression turned reflective. "You know, David, I invited you here because it's been years since we've seen each other. After everything we've been through, it's an honor to finally see you again. I never imagined our reunion would unfold like this, but in a way I'm grateful. It's opened my eyes to issues I should have been more aware of." David nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Life has a way of presenting us with unexpected challenges. What matters is how we respond to them. And John, your response gives me hope." As they continued their meal, the conversation shifted to lighter topics, memories of their shared past, updates on mutual friends, and plans for the future. Despite the rough start, David found himself enjoying the evening, grateful for the chance to reconnect with his old friend. As the dinner drew to a close, Mr. Hargrove raised his glass. "To old friendships," he said, "and to new beginnings. David, I can't thank you enough for your forgiveness and your willingness to help me make this right." David clinked his glass against his friend's. "To new beginnings," he echoed, "and to the hope that our actions here might inspire others to stand up against discrimination wherever they encounter it." As they stood to leave the restaurant, David felt a sense of accomplishment. The visit hadn't gone as planned, but perhaps something good could come out of this difficult experience. He looked down at Max, faithful as always by his side, and felt a surge of gratitude for his loyal companion. Walking towards the elevator, David and Mr. Hargrove continued to chat, their conversation now filled with plans and ideas for positive change. As the elevator doors closed behind them, David felt a renewed sense of purpose. The battle against discrimination was far from over, but tonight had shown that with courage, perseverance, and the support of allies, progress was possible. And for now, that was enough.